June 28th of 1998 was supposed to be a special day for Robbie Middleton of Splendora, Texas. It was his 8th birthday, and he had planned to head over to his best friend's house to invite him for a sleepover to celebrate. Excited for the fun day of festivities ahead, Robbie got dressed and left his home, running down the porch steps and across the street into the woods adjacent to his house as his mother Colleen looked on. His cake and party food sat waiting for his return. Sadly, less than 30 minutes later, the smiling face that Colleen had watched admiringly would be unrecognisable in a cruel case that would send shockwaves across the country. What Robbie's parents hadn't known was that 2 weeks prior, their son had suffered a brutal sexual assault at the hands of a troublesome neighbourhood child, 13-year-old Don Collins, a loner who was known in the neighbourhood for his love of harming things smaller than him. After his mother's death, Don had been sent to live with his father, who was a drug addict and alcoholic. After his father was imprisoned, Don spent time bouncing around relatives' houses, sleeping on floors and couches, until eventually his aunt and uncle, who happened to live in Robbie's neighbourhood, agreed to take him in. Frightened that Robbie was going to tell on him, Don had taken sadistic action. After laying in wait for Robbie in the woods, the same place where he had sexually assaulted him, Don ambushed the younger boy. Using a fishing wire, he then tied him to a tree and doused him with gasoline. Taking a lit match, he then set fire to Robbie. As the fire burned through Robbie's clothing and flesh, it also burned through the fishing wire, eventually freeing Robbie, who was now fully engulfed in flames. With the only thing on Robbie's mind to get back home, he began to walk back through the wooded area, still alight. When he reached his street, the heat became too much and he collapsed in full view of horrified neighbours who rushed to the little boy's aid. Colleen was soon alerted to the commotion outside, and as she walked over to the small figure laying on the pavement with a crowd forming around him, she struggled to comprehend what she was looking at. Initially, she didn't recognise that this was her son. Robbie lay naked with his clothes having been burnt off. His hair, eyelids, lips, ears and genitals had been completely destroyed, and his skin was melting from his body. Also watching from the sidelines was none other than the disturbed teenager who had caused this scene, Don Collins. When emergency services arrived to the scene, they determined that Robbie had 3rd-degree burns across 99.5% of his body. The only part of him that had not been damaged were the soles of his feet. Robbie was rushed to the hospital, but predictions for survival were bleak. He was immediately taken into surgery, where all of the damaged skin was removed from his body. The painstaking process of then replacing his exposed wounds with lab-grown skin then took place. Doctors also took scrapings of the healthy skin from Robbie's feet to regrow more patches of skin for the rest of his body. Miraculously, over the weeks that followed, despite being in unimaginable pain, it was clear that the resilient young boy was going to pull through. Desperate to find out who had done this to him, Robbie was questioned extensively, but denied knowing anything, until finally he said, "Rex got mad at me and threw gas in my face." Investigators knew from interviews with neighbourhood residents that a teenager who lived on Robbie's street was called Rex Taylor. When they tracked him down, however, Rex was able to provide an alibi that he was at a local river with 3 friends at the time of Robbie being burned. Rex, along with his friends, were fully cooperative with police during this time and showed much concern for Robbie. It was clear to law enforcement that these teenagers had not been involved. Meanwhile, Don Collins raised suspicions when he began to insert himself into the investigation, even talking with local news crews about his belief that Rex was in fact the culprit, stating, "Rex told everyone he was swimming, but I know he had time to do it." Soon enough, Don gave a second interview to a reporter and this was closely monitored by detectives working the case, who became alarmed when the teen gave details that had not yet been released to the public regarding the crime scene. Don also made incriminating comments about having burned his hands after playing with gas, and discussed how Robbie had fallen 4 times on his way out of the woods. Bizarrely, Don had also collected remnants of Robbie's burned clothes off of the floor and saved them. Within days, Robbie's mother Colleen contacted detectives to inform them that her son had now confessed that it had in fact been Don Collins who had burned him. Don was arrested and taken into custody, and during a police interview, he made a full confession that he had been involved. On the 31st of July 1998, detectives visited Robbie in hospital and recorded an interview where the young boy said that he had not seen anyone during the attack because they had ambushed him from behind, but he had heard Don Collins' voice. This account soon became unreliable, however, when it was noted how heavily medicated Robbie was. He also began to speak of how other neighbourhood children had been present and had hung him upside down with fishing wire. But Colleen told investigators that this incident had happened a year prior to Robbie being set on fire. Robbie also began to tell of how his grandma had poured scalding coffee over him and that her dog had slammed the door, causing the house to blow up and burn him. It was clear that Robbie was suffering from hallucinations. Mentally traumatised, Robbie began to suffer nightmares, extreme anxiety, and was noted as having a heart rate the equivalent of a runner who had just competed a marathon. Meanwhile, Don Collins was held in a juvenile detention centre, and whilst here, bragged to the other youths about what he had done to Robbie. He made horrific comments about how funny Robbie's eyes looked whilst he was on fire, as though they would pop out of his head. Losing his temper, he also threatened to burn numerous other juveniles in the centre, like he burned Robbie. After around 6 months in the detention centre pending trial, Don Collins was eventually released after the case against him was dismissed on account of lack of evidence. Prosecutors were concerned about Robbie's inconsistent statements regarding the various people he had made accusations against. They also brushed off Don's own confessions whilst in the detention centre as him trying to brag and act tough in front of the other kids. Unfortunately, from here, it seemed as though Don Collins was never going to face justice for what he had done. The Middleton family made every effort to get the case reopened, but it was in vain. Over the years that followed, Robbie Middleton continued to suffer, not only living with the fear that Don Collins would harm another child, but due to the agonising 200 surgeries he would need as part of his ongoing care. Robbie's fears would come true, as in 2001, at the age of 16, Don Collins would serve time in jail for sexually assaulting another 8-year-old boy. He would be released in September of 2011. Sadly, justice for Robbie would finally prevail, but at a tragic cost. In 2010, Robbie Middleton was diagnosed with terminal skin cancer as a direct result of having been set on fire 12 years prior. Now, the Middletons enlisted the help of an attorney named Craig Psycho. Craig was able to breathe life back into the case, obtaining the original case files from 1998 and collecting evidence from physicians and nurses who had treated Robbie. In a last bid to seal Don Collins' fate, Craig Psycho made a taped recording of Robbie as he lay dying, naming Don Collins as the person who had sexually assaulted him and set him alight. Just 17 days after this recording was made, Robbie passed away at just 20 years old. The case had now become a homicide. In December of 2011, a civil trial was conducted where the taped recording of Robbie was played to a jury. As a result, the Middleton family were awarded $150 billion in damages, the largest verdict ever handed out in US history. After this, the criminal investigation was officially reopened in September 2013, at which time Don Collins was now 28 years old. At the trial, a doctor who had treated Robbie, Dr. Herndon, was able to testify that Robbie's death was inevitable, and it had only been the skin grafts that had prolonged his life. Robbie's plastic surgeon, along with the forensic pathologist who carried out his autopsy, also testified that his death was a direct result of the burns he had sustained at Don Collins' hands. Colleen Middleton also took to the stand to provide a heartfelt impact statement about what Robbie and the family had gone through in the years that followed his attack. Painting a picture of the true monster that Don Collins is, 2 more victims were able to testify that he had sexually molested them as well. Robbie's own sister Heather was also able to recall a time in which Don had stomped her kitten to death after she refused to play with him. He had also made attempts to molest her too. The final witness called to the stand was Robbie's physical therapist, Rebecca Whitlock. She was able to provide deep insight into the kind-hearted and selfless boy that Robbie was. She stated that he had never let his injuries define him, and he was dedicated to helping other children who had suffered burns like him. He would even sit for hours outside grocery stores trying to raise funds for burn victims to receive the treatment that they needed. As the video of Robbie Middleton describing that fateful day from his deathbed played out in court, Don paid little attention and sat with his back turned away from the screen, reading a newspaper.
I realized I was on fire.
Can you help me, Mom?
Yeah, he remembers standing up and rubbing his eyes, and then he realized he was on fire.
And when you said Don a minute ago, were you talking about Donald Wilburn Collins?
Yes.
All right. Was there
The jurors deliberated for an hour before reaching a guilty verdict for capital murder. Don Collins was sentenced to the maximum 40 years behind bars. He remained motionless as the verdict was announced.